want me to?
Well, I think we're live. So, hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Pro Democracy Pod. We're very lucky to have Ben Norton in the house, or the Casa, since he's in Nicaragua. He's actually just like an hour or two ago published a new article. I got a chance to read through it really quickly. It's on the Gray Zone. It's called Debunking Myths About Nicaragua's 2021 elections under attack by USA, EU, and OAS. So it's a very, very timely that we have him on, because actually I'm a little bit angry because last week we had Richard Medhurst and Kevin Gostola to talk about the extradition hearings against Julian Assange, the appeal to the U.S. appeal to the non-extradition by the UK courts. And a day prior, Katie Halper had both of those guests on to talk about the same thing. Now, today we have Ben Norton, and I think yesterday Katie Halper had Ben on to talk about Nicaragua and the elections. So thank you, Katie. We appreciate it. Here's Ben's new article. We're going to be talking about this. We're going to have some more general questions about Nicaragua and, I guess, socialism in Latin America. So everybody go check out the Gray Zone after the stream if you want to read it. It's a very informative piece. One thing that you had one part of your article, Ben, that was just, I think, really well stated. So I'm going to read that because it's kind of key to understanding the U.S. strategy, the destabilization strategy, as you kind of outline in your article. Over the past 30 days or so, there's been a ramping up of the hybrid warfare against Nicaragua, which has included sanctions and, not recognizing the results of the election, and a number of other measures. The corporate media has been fully on board with this and doing the work of the State Department for them in parroting false claims. And we can talk more about that in a bit. But I do want to, one of the false claims is that there were like 7 presidential candidates that were barred from running against Daniel Ortega. Which is not true, because they weren't candidates, as you point out in your article. They were just kind of like wealthy people, elite, who never did any of the paperwork to like run for office or anything. And none of them were in prison because they were running against Daniel Ortega. They were in prison because of various crimes that they have committed. I think mostly, and correct me if I'm wrong, mostly in the 2018 US-backed coup attempt. So what you write is, if an opposition figure is arrested for violating a law in Nicaragua in an offense that would be punishable in any country, Washington often reflexively responds by dubbing that person a, quote, political prisoner. If they are wealthy and powerful, the U.S. claims they were, quote, presidential hopeful, even if they made no effort whatsoever to go through the legal process of officially registering as a candidate. This is a way to try to maintain impunity for U.S.-backed coup plotters and money launderers. It's the geopolitical equivalent of the strategy that Washington-sponsored insurgents in Hong Kong openly espoused to the New York Times. And then you quote the New York Times there about Hong Kong. I personally went to a conference in D.C. where there was a former legislator turned democracy activist, quote unquote, from Hong Kong, where he was talking about persecution, authoritarianism in Hong Kong, alleged, and it turns out I'm like doing a bit of Googling on him later on, and he was the spokesman for a group that included a guy who was arrested for harboring explosives. It was like the most explosives anyone had been arrested for in Hong Kong since like the 90s, early 90s. So this is what they do. I mean, this is the strategy. They fund these violent insurrectionists, actual insurrectionists, to go, burn down government buildings, terrorize people in the streets. They get arrested. They call them political prisoners. And then the U.S. uses those political prisoners to further advance the regime change cause with propaganda about how, this is an authoritarian crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. So it's the perfect topic for our show. I'm so happy to have you on, Ben.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And I mean, I'm glad you singled out that section of my article. In fact, if you can let me share the screen really quickly, I just want to highlight this article that was published in the New York Times, and really people need to, I think, study this. Like, this is, if you read this article, it'll help explain more than 50 other articles to combine what one of the key strategies for these soft coup attempts is today. I mean, many times they're not actually that soft, but the term soft coup is often used to refer to a coup that doesn't involve necessarily a military takeover, but a color revolution or lawfare using the judicial system to prevent candidates like Lula da Silva from running. That's an actual example of a soft coup, not in Nicaragua, but rather in Brazil, where the United States helped imprison Lula da Silva in 2018 to prevent him from being the candidate, which is the reason that the fascist candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, won. It's because he was imprisoned on false charges of corruption that have totally been recanted. I mean, he's totally innocent. But anyway, this article says so much about how the strategy works. It's in the New York Times. It's called "A Hong Kong Protester's Tactic: Get the Police to Hit You." And it's subtitled "Using Aggressive Nonviolence to Provoke the Authorities and Win Over the Public." This is from June of 2019. And notice that the New York Times says it's by Fred Chan Ho Fai. And all it says is Mr. Chan is a Hong Konger. It doesn't have any other information about him. Like, he's a Hong Konger. That's it. That would be like John Bolton writing an article in the New York Times, and they say John Bolton is an American. Elliot Abrams is an American.
But I remember when this article came out, and I thought to myself, like, imagine doing this with American police. Like, you would just get shot.
They would execute you on the spot and laugh about it. But here, this is the money quote here. So he talks about this idea of marginal violence theory, and it holds that protesters should not actively use or advocate violence. Lol. I mean, that's exactly what they did. But instead, use the most aggressive, nonviolent actions possible to push the police and the government to their limits. And then what happens is that you use the government's response, and then everyone has a camera. There's nonstop live streaming. There's constant, international media coverage, foreign journalists 24/7. So then you use the footage of the response to the government to the violence, and you take that footage out of context and say that this is the authoritarian regime repressing the people. That strategy represents not just the strategy on the ground, but as I said, that's kind of the geopolitical equivalent of the strategy that Washington uses around the world and has been using since the end of the first Cold War, the rise of the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, your show is about this, right? The rise of like the democracy industry, the human rights industry. So instead of having like an old school style, full-on Pinochet military coup, I mean, we did see something similar in Bolivia, but the majority of coups these days are not that kind of old school military coup. Most of them are more sophisticated soft coups that involve a combination of like legal warfare through the judicial system, lawfare, economic warfare through sanctions causing an economic crisis. Then you delegitimize the electoral system, which they're trying to do in Nicaragua, which the U.S. and the EU refuse to recognize the government in Venezuela. They refuse to recognize the government in Belarus. So this is the new playbook for a coup. And what they did in Hong Kong is like the local version of that. But at the nation state level, Nicaragua is the exact same strategy, where what you do is you provoke the Nicaraguan government with extreme forms of meddling, with a violent coup attempt in 2018 in which hundreds of people were killed, with several rounds of sanctions that hurt the economy and caused economic problems and caused economic decline and the GDP to shrink. Then you try to isolate the country diplomatically, and you funnel the country, you funnel millions of dollars into the country, flooding opposition groups with millions of dollars to try to destabilize the government. And then if the government takes a response in any way to try to crack down on all of that, then you isolate the government's response and portray that as a form of aggression and say that this is an example of the government being a supposed authoritarian regime and a dictatorship. That's exactly what the playbook is in Venezuela, in Belarus, and of course here in in Nicaragua right now. So just for people to understand, I think people can't really wrap their minds around what's happening in Nicaragua without understanding the 2018 coup attempt. For Nicaraguans, 2018 is like 9/11 for North Americans, right? Like in the U.S. political consciousness, and which has been also perpetuated through popular culture, there's this idea of like the before times, well, even before COVID, but like the before times before 9/11 and the times after 9/11, right? And you have the war on terror and the police state grows and all of that. And you can't understand what happened in Nicaragua in the elections without understanding the 2018 coup attempt. Nicaragua is a very peaceful country in a region that is very violent. Nicaragua has a lower murder rate than the United States. Nicaragua is next door to Honduras and El Salvador, which have the highest murder rates in the world. And Nicaragua is also, not only is it a very peaceful country, but it is a country that has had a lot of political stability, whereas in 2009, the U.S. fell in Honduras. In El Salvador, there's been an economic crisis and a political crisis going on. So in 2018, you had years, over a decade of the Sandinistas coming back into power in 2007. So you had 11 years of stability, economic growth, free education, universal socialized healthcare. You had all these social programs to help people. You had a lot of public safety. Women definitely are much better treated in Nicaragua than other parts of the region. And then in 2018, out of nowhere, you had this extremely violent 3-month coup attempt. It wasn't just a week. It was 3 months of daily violence with several people killed per day. And what that did is it shocked a lot of people. And one, it actually ironically strengthened the Sandinistas. And it also radicalized the opposition to the degree that they became like mouth-foaming far-right Pinochet people. And you can see some of the responses. In fact, I'm going to get up a tweet here showing the kind of death threats and the other threats I get on Twitter from these fascists in Nicaragua. Like the right-wing opposition has been extremely radicalized in Nicaragua because the coup failed. And in this coup, roughly 300 people were killed, inconsistent, and some people say higher numbers, but they're totally fake. And people have done reports showing that, like Amnesty International and all these fake human rights groups, they published these lists of so-called deaths in the coup attempt and tried to blame the government. But some of the people who were killed in the coup attempt that were blamed by the government, that were blamed on the government, actually were people who died in like traffic accidents or just like other random deaths. So anyway, the point is that after this coup attempt, the Nicaraguan government took action against the coup plotters. And because the Nicaraguan government took action against the coup plotters, because it imprisoned them for taking millions of dollars from the U.S. government to try to overthrow violently their elected government, then the U.S. and the OAS and the EU went on this long campaign to try to portray them as political prisoners and as so-called pre-candidates. And really quickly here, if you let me share my screen, this is an idea of the Nicaraguan opposition. I mean, there are factions, but this is just like this young dude. I don't even know who this guy is, but this Nicaraguan guy who just sent me this DM the other day. Communist son of a bitch. When Mr. Trump returns to the presidency, I hope they put you in a concentration camp because that's where you deserve to be. But I mean, I'm like a North American. Imagine if you're like a poor working class Sandinista and they don't give a single shit about your life, and they'll murder you and set your body on fire, which is what they did to a lot of Sandinistas. So these are the people the U.S. backed. And then when it failed in 2018, then you go to a series of other tactics, which is you impose sanctions with economic warfare. Then you try to delegitimize the government by saying that it should be kicked out of the OAS and what other organizations. which, I mean, good riddance. We can talk about the OAS anyway. They should leave. I mean, they're probably going to leave before they get kicked out. And then you do what you're doing now, and then the OAS, then the next phase. After the coup attempt fails, then you try coups by other means. And just as in Venezuela in 2017, there was another very similar violent coup attempt in Venezuela, which failed. So then after that failed, then they tried the whole thing with Juan Guaido and the sanctions and all of that. Similarly, in Belarus, they refused to recognize the government after the election, which even many critics of Lukashenko admit that he obviously won the election. Now, maybe he didn't win by the percentage as high as he said, but it's clear that Lukashenko has over 50% support and he won the election. But then they delegitimize the election, say he's a dictator, and then refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the Belarusian government, create a neoliberal regime in exile, and then impose sanctions. This is the playbook. And this is exactly what's happening in Nicaragua. And ever since the 2018 coup attempt, the opposition has gotten more and more desperate. And as the government has taken action to punish them for taking millions of dollars from the U.S. to try to violently overthrow the government, then the U.S. response has become more and more punitive. So the propaganda campaign is a direct response to that. The propaganda campaign in the media is part and parcel of the new form of political warfare and soft coups, right? Because you can't carry out all the sanctions and the delegitimization of the political system and the refusal to recognize the elections. You can't do all of that without preparing the fertile soil with months of fake news. And that's exactly what's happening in Nicaragua.
And it's like the playbook, it's like the same tired playbook, and yet like it's people still think they can do it. I saw this like viral thing with Keith Olbermann, and I thought he was just like around to cry about vaccines or something. But he was like telling someone that he was being a whore for a dictator.
He was telling Wyatt Reed, friend of the show, who was a journalist who was here in Nicaragua. I mean, I saw him at the voting poll, like the voting centers, and
that's where they do democracy.
Yeah. And so Wyatt Reed was just reporting on the election and criticizing corporate media propaganda, New York Times fake news about the election, and saying that I'm here in Nicaragua. This is what I've seen. So Keith Olbermann, after slamming his fist on the desk and yelling at his computer, he tweeted out, "You're a whore for a dictator."
And it's it just feels like such a tired tactic at this point, because it's just something you hear all the time now. If you're critical of if you're remotely critical of US media narratives, which common sense should direct us to be, it's just now all of a sudden it's just like, it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction from them to just throw that accusation out. And the consequences, like, you never really get to have a real conversation about what's going on.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of that Keith Olbermann tweet, a lot of people criticized him and said, what is it like being a whore for like the war machine, and like what is it like being a whore for the American ruling class? And I'm trying to find this tweet here, but Danny Haifong, he was actually suspended from Twitter for, well, not suspended permanently, but his account was restricted for 12 hours. Here we go. If you can let me share my screen here, I'll get this tweet up. So Keith Olbermann, a multimillionaire who signed like a $30 million contract with MSNBC-IA, he called Wyatt a whore for a dictator. And so Danny Haifong responded saying, what is it like to get that ratio, because you're a whore for the American oligarchy? And he was suspended for 12 hours and had to delete his tweet. So, I mean, it just shows the incredible double standard of these social media corporations. And actually, really quickly, while I'm on the subject of these social media corporations just censoring people criticizing the powerful, I want to highlight another thing that happened exactly 7 days before the election here in Nicaragua, which just shows like how blatant the election meddling is. If you can let me share my screen. So this is an article I wrote November 2nd. This happened on around midnight on Halloween and like November 1st, that Facebook did a coordinated purge on Facebook and Instagram of over 1,000 major Sandinista activists, journalists, and media outlets in Nicaragua. A lot of major people who are pro-Sandinista voices on Facebook and Instagram. And then also Twitter purged the same people. And then YouTube followed up by erasing 82 Sandinista media channels on YouTube. And in response, so the day that they were purged, these Sandinistas, they went to Twitter, because at first they were only purged from Facebook and Instagram. So they went to Twitter and they started posting videos. And I know these people. Like, you can see here, these are like videos with some of these Sandinista activists. I know who they are. Some of them are like friends of mine, or just like people I just know in person. And so they started posting videos on Twitter. And in response, Twitter took down their accounts as well. Like, so it's just like erasing the existence of these people. And as I pointed out in this article as well, the guy who wrote this bogus report, Ben Nimmo, is a former NATO press officer. In the Facebook report, he admits they took down authentic accounts in addition to inauthentic accounts. They called them all bots, but then they admit that some of them are authentic accounts. So it's like, it's clear political censorship. And this guy, Ben Nimmo, before he became the head of like intelligence at Facebook, he worked for this group Graphica, which is funded by DARPA and the Pentagon. And then he also works alongside this guy. You can see here in these tweets. Here, I'll get at this other tweet really quickly. It just shows how much Facebook has totally merged with the U.S. government. So here, if you let me share my screen, these tweets show this guy was cheering on the Facebook purge of Sandinistas, again, 7 days before the elections in Nicaragua. And here, this guy is the former director of intelligence at the White House National Security Council. He's now the director of threat disruption at Facebook. And he's not the only one. Look at this guy. This guy, Nathaniel Gleitcher, is the director of cybersecurity policy. Sorry, he was the director of cybersecurity policy at the White House National Security Council. Now he's the head of security policy at Facebook. So, and before that, he was at the DOJ. So
and CSIS.
Yeah, the neocon think tank. So Facebook just farms out its so-called security and so-called intelligence teams that aren't very intelligent or secure to the White House. It's just recruiting these people from the U.S. government. And then days before the election in Nicaragua, and they did the same thing in Venezuela and Iran, they just purge people who support the government to try to dominate the narrative around the elections, to try to delegitimize the election. So now there aren't many Nicaraguans who can criticize the narrative saying that the election was supposedly fraudulent. It's the same playbook. And it's becoming more and more obvious, and it's becoming more and more authoritarian. I mean, the U.S. calls itself some great democracy, and consistently every time Venezuela or Nicaragua or Iran or any other official enemy country, anytime they try to have an election, the U.S. forces the opposition to try to boycott the election. And it pushes out tons of fake news and propaganda that delegitimizes it, refuses to recognize the results, bans people on social media who criticize the U.S. and so they can't speak out against the fake news, and then recognizes a parallel puppet regime that was never elected by anyone. And not just Juan Guaido, but also Tikhanovskaya, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in Belarus. She was never elected. She never got a single vote. This is the playbook.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean they did the same thing with the Syrian National Council. They've done this before. The Dalai Lama, of course, was like the first version of that.
Before you could say Chiang Kai-shek was the first.
Right.
Taiwan.
Really quick, I want to apologize to our Rockfin viewers. We started a few minutes late, so if you want to catch the beginning of the stream, either wait till the end and just go back. I don't know whose idea it was to give me a podcast. I'm really bad at this. But you can just, rewind to the beginning if you want to catch that later on or now and catch up if you're just joining. I'm glad that you brought up these like kind of fake presidents because you talk about the Nicaraguan version who's like an oligarch heiress, Cristina Chamorro. Now with Venezuela, they at least had like they at least tried to like legally finesse his legitimacy, Juan Guaido's. He was the president of the National Assembly. They said the country was in crisis, and therefore the Constitution permitted Juan Guaido to become the president. What kind of rationale were they weighing? Because she's been in prison for money laundering, so that plan never panned out for the United States. But what kind of rationale did they have to just be like, yeah, this oligarch is going to be the president?
Well, really quickly, just for people who want to see, I just want to share this video. If you can let me share my screen. This is one of the things I do as a journalist is I try to keep track of all of the ghouls and monsters and gargoyles in Washington and all the think tanks on K Street, right? So they hold these meetings that like these panel discussions that have like all these prominent opposition leaders and people with like 5 PhDs and they've never left the academy and have 0 friends except like Elliot Abrams. And so they bring all these people on their panel discussions, and then like 8 people watch them at like the Atlantic Council or whatever. You look at these YouTube videos and they have like 30 views. So this was a panel discussion hosted by a US government funded group called the InterAmerican Dialogue, or just the Dialogue. This is a DC think tank that is closely affiliated with the Democratic Party. And basically what it serves as is like a like a laboratory to farm out Latin America foreign policy, so-called experts and diplomats for Democratic administrations. So when the Obama Latin American foreign policy team that planned the coup in Honduras and the soft coup in Brazil and the soft coup in Paraguay, when they left office and Trump came in, a lot of them went to go work at the Inter-American Dialogue, this think tank in DC. And Biden's current Central America special envoy, who is currently overseeing Nicaragua policy, he also worked at the Inter-American Dialogue, and he's in this video we'll see in a second. So this is from a video that the Inter-American Dialogue hosted with Cristina Chamorro, who is the right-wing, extremely wealthy oligarch from the most powerful family in Nicaragua. The Chamorros have had 7 presidents in the history of Nicaragua since the modern nation state was formed 150 years ago. So they're like the oligarch family. They're the descendants of the Spanish colonialists. They're one of the wealthiest families in the country. They have a bunch of children who are all like the right-wing opposition oligarchs, and they control all of the right-wing media in the country. So she is basically an employee of the U.S. government. I'll talk about how in a second, but I'll just play this video here. This is her, and this is Biden's Central America special envoy. And here is the former president of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla. And here is a former top minister in a right-wing Guatemalan government, all saying half jokingly, but also obviously that they would recognize Chamorro as so-called interim president like Juan Guaido. Here's the video.
So thank you, President Chamorro. Thank you. Excuse me.
Not yet.
Not yet. That's right.
Yeah, just hold on.
Let me go back. This guy is Biden's State Department special envoy for Central America, accidentally referring to her as President Chamorro. Like, oops, you screwed that up, dude.
But thank you, President Chamorro. Thank you. Excuse me.
Not yet.
Not yet. That's
it. Not yet.
Wow.
Right.
Just hold on.
That's right. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you see a screen like this.
And Ricardo, it was
This is Laura Chinchilla, the former president of Costa Rica.
premonition that led you say President Chamorro. But we certainly welcome any Democratic leader in that country.
So that's Costa Rica saying we're on board too.
In terms to restore democracy.
Great. Thank you very much, Cristina. Eduardo Stein.
As President Cristina said,
Eduardo Stein is a former top minister in a right-wing Guatemalan government. Again, half jokingly referring to her as President Cristina. Sorry, former vice president of Guatemala.
there are undoubtedly communicating threads throughout different areas of concern.
So, I mean, when I saw that, I was like, okay, it's pretty clear what's going to happen. That was back in February when that happened, that event. And it just became more and more obvious as time went on. So, really quickly, to understand what happened with her, she was imprisoned. You asked about what the rationale for recognizing her. The rationale for recognizing her is that she's the daughter of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who is the first right-wing president of Nicaragua after the 1979 Sandinista revolution. So the Sandinistas came to power in a revolution after years of armed struggle against the right-wing military dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza. In July 1979, they overthrew the U.S.-backed puppet dictatorship and had a revolution. And then in 1985 and in 1990, they had democratic elections. In 85, Ortega and the Sandinistas won the election. Now, of course, people probably know that in the 1980s, Washington, the CIA, backed a brutal terrorist war in Nicaragua, funding the Contras, these death squads that, as one of their leaders, their former leaders, who was a Chamorro, by the way, a Chamorro oligarch, one of the children, he admitted that the Contras burned down schools and hospitals faster than the Sandinistas can build them. And anyway, the point is that after this decade of terrorist war by the CIA, and after years of a U.S. economic blockade of Nicaragua in the 1980s, just like the economic blockade of Cuba and the economic blockade now of Venezuela, after a decade, the U.S. government had a gun to the collective head of the Nicaraguan people and said, if you don't vote out the Sandinistas in the 1990 elections, then we're going to continue waging war through the contra terrorists and through economic war. So in 1990, the Sandinistas were voted out, and it was the first time in modern history where a revolutionary government agreed to step down after democratic elections. The Sandinistas stepped down, and that campaign in 1990 was created, funded, and completely every level led by the CIA through the National Endowment for Democracy. In fact, that was one of the NED's first major operations. Its first operations were the Solidarity fake labor union in Poland to carry out the coup, the color revolution in Poland against the socialist government, using a right-wing Catholic Church allied labor union called Solidarity, backed also by the AFL-CIA. AFL-CIO. And then the other major first NED operation was in Nicaragua, and it was running the campaign of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who was a totally apolitical figure. She was just a wealthy oligarch, and it was seen as like a moderate consensus figure who could unite like the radical right wingers and like the more like slightly more moderate opposition. And so when she came to power, she was a total puppet of the U.S. And then she privatized everything, including water and electricity. She literally sold off the railroads to foreign companies. Like, she just sold out the country. And so her daughter is Cristina Chamorro. And so to answer your question, Cristina Chamorro has no actual like democratic legitimacy. She's never been a politician. She's never been in the National Assembly. She's never won a single vote. She's never won an election. But her qualifications are that, one, she's the daughter of the former president. Two, that she was picked by the U.S. because she's an empty slate, and the U.S. knew she would immediately follow orders. And three, because she has two jobs, which are sinecures. She doesn't do anything in those jobs. And those are both jobs which are basically funded by the U.S. government. One is that she is the vice president of the major right-wing newspaper La Prensa, which is funded by the NED, and which also in the 80s was backed by the CIA. And the CIA used La Prensa, not only funded it, but used it to spread fake news against the Sandinistas, claiming falsely that the Sandinistas killed civilians and all this nonsense. So La Prensa is a longtime CIA front funded today by the NED, and it's led by the Chamorro family. It's owned by the Chamorro family, and she's like the vice president, which means nothing. And then her other so-called qualification is that she is the president, was the president until early this year, of this foundation called the Chamorro Foundation, which was founded by her mom when she left office. And the Chamorro Foundation is the main recipient of CIA money in Nicaragua, as a pass-through, they call it. So the Chamorro Foundation has received millions and tens of millions of dollars from the NED and USAID, and then uses that money to send it to other right-wing opposition groups in Nicaragua. And the reason that she was arrested for money laundering is because, the last thing I'll say here, and I'll pitch it back to you, now this is a long answer, but last year in 2020, the democratically elected National Assembly in Nicaragua passed a law that is a foreign agents law, which is basically almost identical to the FARA law in the US, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is over 80 years old. It goes back to around the time of World War II. So the foreign agents law in Nicaragua, very controversial. It says that if you take foreign government funding for your organization, you need to register as a foreign agent, which, like, again, most countries in the world have a very similar law. Like, there's nothing controversial about that. But the Biden administration knew that that would mean that a lot of its puppets would have to either voluntarily suspend operations or register as foreign agents, and they would never register as foreign agents, so they would have to voluntarily suspend operations. So the Chamorro Foundation, in protest of the law, voluntarily suspended its operations. It was not forced by the government. They voluntarily suspended operations because they didn't want to register as a foreign agent, because they get tens of millions of dollars from the US government to fund the opposition and to fund all of the fake news outlets, all of the extreme propaganda outlets here, which played a huge role in the coup, spreading fake news and the coup attempt of 2018. So Cristina Chamorro, the daughter, she shut down the foundation that she was running, and then she put all of that money in her personal bank account. That's called money laundering. That is not legal. And so she was arrested for money laundering. And then the U.S. said, this is a political prisoner. She is a so-called pre-candidate, even though she never registered. She was never a candidate. But what happens is that when the Nicaraguan government finally takes action against these U.S. government-funded coup plotters, when they finally imprison them, like Venezuela never did with Juan Guaido, imagine if Venezuela had imprisoned Juan Guaido. The U.S. would have said he's a political prisoner. There would have been all this propaganda. That's why they didn't imprison him, even though he's violated 1,000 laws every month. So the Nicaraguan government, they nipped it in the bud. They were like, screw this. We're not letting another Juan Guaido happen here. We're imprisoning these coup plotters. And they're guilty of money laundering. They're guilty of all of the stuff. We have all of the documents. These documents are public. We have documents from the NED. We have documents from USAID. The government has documents that they got from confessions from people, that they got from police, that they got from internal spies and all this stuff. They have all the documents proving it. So they were like, screw this. We're cracking down on these criminals, and we're imprisoning them for money laundering, treason, conspiring with the foreign government, plotting a coup, funding violent groups, and they imprisoned them. So because these U.S. assets were imprisoned, the U.S. said they're political prisoners, and then it went a step further and said, not only are they political prisoners, they're actually pre-candidates or presidential hopefuls. You know, that doesn't mean anything. I'm a presidential hopeful. One day I would love to be president of the Soviet Union of North America. I would love to be president of the United States and then dissolve the United States. That would be great. So I'm a presidential hopeful. It means nothing. So that, anyway, I know that was a long answer, but it's a complicated issue. That is where this narrative comes from, that the Nicaraguan government supposedly arrested 7 pre-candidates or presidential hopefuls who are never candidates and who are never registered. All it means is that the U.S. government coup plotters, they actually faced legal consequences for once, because Nicaragua didn't want the U.S. to recognize one of them as the fake Juan Guaido of Nicaragua.
Yeah, I'm, and again, there's a lot of parallels here with Hong Kong with their national security law, basically doing much of the same, creating more regulation and oversight of foreign funding. But we're going to end the Twitter live stream. I hope that you join us on Rockfin. It's rockfin.com/prodempod. That's Rockfin with a K. Hope to see you over there. I'm glad you mentioned, Ben, the Atlantic Council's live stream and how it has like 8 views on YouTube. I'm sure mostly journalists from the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN who don't ever report anything meaningful. But on that note, let's get some more views on Rockfin than the Atlantic Council does on YouTube.
That's very important. Yeah, I think to what you're speaking to as well, like this whole outcry over like having these laws about foreign agents is really funny to me, especially like coming from the US or like the Democratic Party, especially like in light of Russiagate, because it's like if you share like if it's like Russians sharing memes on Facebook, then it's like, oh my God, people need to go to jail for this. The president needs to be impeached for this. But when it's like an actual concern about foreign agents spreading like actual misinformation in a country, then all of a sudden it's like, it just is so transparent to me.
Yeah,
I do have
I'm gonna get up some of these memes that supposedly were used to steal the election. So, of course, people probably know that
reach out to Jesus and we'll beat it together.
Yeah, I'm trying to find this beat it together.
While you look for that, I have a minor bone to pick. You said that the term pre-candidate is meaningless, but I distinctly remember Hillary Clinton being a pre-candidate for like 3 years before 2016.
Yeah, exactly. All it means is that one day you might want to be an actual candidate, but until then, you're just a pre-candidate or a hopeful. So here's this tweet. Ironically, it was Russiagate conspiracy theory promoter Chris Hayes who tweeted this. Ironically, but if you let me share my screen, this is. So the U.S. government, the FBI spent how many millions, maybe billions of dollars over years of investigating, and the only evidence it found of Russia supposedly meddling in the 2016 election is this group supposedly backed by Russia called the Internet Research Agency, the bad IRA, not to be confused with the good IRA. This group supposedly bought these memes.
I'm sorry, those memes are based though. I think they're both the good IRAs.
Yeah,
no. Oh yeah, I mean no. These. I'm just saying that like the other IRA is way cooler. Gotcha. I mean whatever. Like you can't compare with the other IRA, which talk about based. Anyway, so this IRA, this meme is awesome. So for people who are just like listening and not just watching, the meme says, "Quote: struggling with addiction to masturbation, reach out to me and we'll beat it together." And it says Jesus. You can't hold hands with God when you are masturbating. So the U.S., the FBI claimed with a serious face that Russia meddled in the U.S. election with memes like this. Or I'm going to share another meme. Do you all remember Buff Bernie?
Yeah, the coloring book, right?
See, yeah. As soon as I see that Jesus meme, I think to myself, yes, Hillary Clinton should be locked up in prison. So I do think they have a point.
If you let me
I think that all the time anyway, so I don't know if it's the meme or not.
This is the meme that the FBI claimed that Russia meddled in the election by creating an account on Facebook called LGBT United and posting Buff Bernie. So meanwhile, the U.S. has spent millions of dollars funding these extreme coup plotters, and they carried out a violent coup attempt. And I mean, the hypocrisy is really incredible. And actually, one more time, I'm just going to get up another article here to show you, because I've done so much reporting on this on Nicaragua, because really no one else does. So here I have an article up on the screen. This is an article I published in June, how USAID created Nicaragua's anti-Sandinista media apparatus, now under money laundering investigation. So here I show the documents. This is from USAID. It shows how the U.S. government, through the CIA cutout, was sending millions of dollars to the so-called media strengthening program, and that money, you can see here, went to the Fundación Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, which is the Chamorro Foundation. And then that's just the money on the table. Here's another document from the Spanish Agency for International Development, which is modeled directly after USAID. So this is Spain's version of the same kind of thing. And you can see them. This is them in 2020 giving over nearly $1 million, over 800,000 euro to the Chamorro Foundation. And again, Cristina Chamorro, she dissolved the Chamorro Foundation, and all that money went into her personal bank account. So, and these are the people funded by the U.S. as so-called journalists. This guy right here, his name is Miguel Mora. He's like a far-right extremist. He runs this fake news outlet called 100% Noticias, which means 100% news. But a lot of people in Nicaragua call it 100% mentiras, which means 100% lies. And this guy, Max, asked him to do an interview. And because, Max is like a white American dude with like a gringo accent, the guy was like, sweet, this guy's going to support me. I'm going to do an interview with him. So he did this interview with Max. And Max was like, what do you want to see the U.S. do? And he was like, yeah, I want the U.S. to invade, like they did it in Panama. So he said, what I see from the United States is a Noriega-style operation, like in Panama. They come, they grab the Ortega Murillo family, referring to the president, Ortega, and they take them away. So this is one of the guys whose so-called media outlet is funded by the U.S. government through the Chamorro Foundation. So USAID would send millions of dollars to Nicaragua, and then as a so-called media strengthening program to support so-called alternative and independent media, in scare quotes, which is really just U.S. government-funded media. And that money would go through the Chamorro Foundation to the right-wing coup plotters at the fake news outlets like him, who were using their so-called media outlets literally to go on air and call for a U.S. invasion and to call for people to go out in the streets. And on 100% Noticias, this U.S. government-funded outlet, there's a video that we published where you can see on a stream, they have an entire 30-minute segment where they talk about the various ways that people could kill President Ortega. They were like, we should send a group of 500 people armed, and we should take over the presidential house, which is not a palace, presidential house, and we should take over and kill the security guards and then kill the president and hang his body in public. They said that openly in a live stream, and they weren't suspended by Facebook or YouTube. And this is a U.S. government-funded so-called independent media outlet in Nicaragua.
But Brandon should make everyone go insane, get arrested on terrorism charge.
Well, it's such a revealing. It's such a revealing. Oh, go ahead,
Brandon. I feel.
You're gonna get us suspended from Rockfin. No, it's just such a revealing dynamic where what the U.S. is doing is 300 times worse than what Russia was accused of doing. On one hand, you have Russia accused of attempting to influence an election, right? Using pancake recipes and retweets of Joyanne Reid. And then on the other hand, because if you go through the database of supposed tweets from Russian bot accounts, that's what you see. That's the kind of shit you see. And then on the other hand, you have USAID and NED not even trying to influence an election, but trying to overthrow the government. And that's fine by Facebook standards. That's fine by the media standards. The only ones with any kind of issues with it are the people of Nicaragua, who overwhelmingly support the government, and fortunately, journalists like Ben Norton, who, what a great service to our, knowledge you've been providing, on the machinations of U.S. policy in Nicaragua. So I want to ask, what does Nicaraguan socialism look like? Because you live there, you've been living there for maybe a year and a half, if I'm guessing correctly.
Yeah, almost 2 years in a few weeks. Yeah.
So what does socialism look like there from your experience?
It's different everywhere you go, right? And there's a lot of similarities with Venezuela and Cuba. There are some differences. I've never been to China. I've never been to Vietnam, but there's similarities and differences. I mean, it sounds like a college essay. There's a land of contrast with similarities and differences. But let's talk about the most important things. The health system is totally socialized. I mean, there are private doctors in addition, but there is a socialized healthcare system, which is extremely important because this is a very poor country. It's actually the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, according to GDP. Although, as we all know, GDP is not a great metric because according to GDP, if a company buys back its own shares, that increases GDP. I mean, the entire U.S. economy is built on like this financial smoke and mirrors to make the GDP look really big, when in reality, everyone knows the Chinese economy is actually bigger. The real economy in China is bigger in terms of GDP, but in terms of reality, but the GDP is this fake number. So anyway, whatever. According to GDP, Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but it has one of the best healthcare systems. I have friends whose parents or grandparents had cancer, and they got all treatment, including chemotherapy, for free. They didn't pay a single cent, which is incredible. I mean, think about it in the US. One of the most common cause of bankruptcy for a household in the US is medical debt. And the most common cause of medical debt bankruptcy is cancer. So meanwhile, that's in like one of the richest countries on earth. Meanwhile, in the global south, in a poor country in Nicaragua, people can get all levels of treatment, including cancer, for free. So that's extremely important. And that's something that only came into effect after the Sandinistas returned to power through democratic elections. In the 2006 elections, and they came to power in 2007, President Ortega promised, as part of his campaign, he promised that like within the first few months, that he would create a universal healthcare system and a free education system. And that's exactly what he did. The free higher education system is also extremely important, because when the Sandinistas, when they lost power in 1990 until 2007, there was a 17-year period there of neoliberal rule, of 3 different right-wing puppet governments basically ruled by the US. They were extremely corrupt. I mentioned they sold off everything. They privatized water. They sold off the electrical company to a Spanish they sold off the electrical utility to a Spanish company, which, I mean, like, okay, so in the 1500s, Spain colonized Latin America, and then in the 1990s and 2000s, the neoliberals sold off the electrical grid in Nicaragua to a Spanish company. I mean, it's basically the same thing, right? So anyway, the Sandinistas reversed the privatizations. They nationalized the water. They nationalized the electricity. Anyway, the point is that in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of poor and working class Nicaraguans, they barely even had school. And there's all these horror stories I've heard from people of children who in the neoliberal era, they literally had to bring chairs to school. They had to bring like those plastic chairs, like those really cheap plastic chairs to school, because there were no desks. And I've heard so many stories of people saying that, like, we didn't have any school supplies, we didn't have books in the neoliberal era, and all the rich elite neoliberal oligarchs just stole all the money, and they just stored it in offshore bank accounts and looted the country. That's how they always operate, right?
And burn it down.
Sounds exactly like how Lebanon is right now. And so, like, I mean, I don't know as much about like Latin America, but it sounds exactly the same. And it's not good, and it doesn't go in a good direction.
Yeah, so if you're like part of the 10% of the elites, or even smaller, 10% of the elites that have access to dollars or euros, you can pay for private education, private security. You can get like a tank of a car, like one of those big Humvees, and just drive around in like your own personal security, and then like just ignore the rest of the country as the country goes to hell. That's how the neoliberal era was, right? And now the government actually is a popular government that has all those programs. Another very important program that I should mention is a housing program, because the level of housing, I mean, I know, Alex, you've been to Honduras. Like in Central America, this is one of the poorest regions of the world, and there are slums throughout all Central American countries. There's very low quality housing. Now there are nice houses, and there are rich people living in these huge mansions, like the kind of like gated communities you see in Miami. The same kind of disgusting, grotesque architecture in Miami. They're based on the same. They want to be in Miami. That's why. So anyway, the point is that there's these huge inequalities, and there's very low quality housing, especially in Central America, because people can live basically outside because the temperature never is cold. So they have like no roofs, or they have like metal roofs that are like really crappy with holes in them, and they have like metal walls, and it's like living in a can. Like it's really, so the Sandinista government has put a lot of resources into creating a public housing program. Now they're not making mansions, they're making very modest homes, but they're these very high quality concrete homes that are like good quality in these planned communities, and they look nice, and you live with like your neighbors, and they're very cheap. And what you do is depending on your income, you pay like usually like $40 a month for like 10 years. And then the federal government pays 1/3, and the local government pays another third of the cost. And then you pay like $40 a month for like 10 years, and the house belongs to you.
Wow.
So they have a housing program. They have all of these social programs, jobs programs. Another thing I should mention that's a key part of the Sandinista revolution is women play a huge role, which is interesting because there's so much propaganda from all these bourgeois feminists claiming that Nicaragua is so horrible for women because abortion is illegal. And yes, abortion is illegal. Like in Venezuela, abortion is illegal. But if you actually look at polls, the vast majority of people in Nicaragua and Venezuela, including Sandinistas and Chavistas, oppose abortion. I know people who are hardcore revolutionaries from the left wing and the Sandinista front. They call themselves communists. They call themselves Marxist-Leninists, and they're against abortion. It's a cultural thing, and it's a religious thing, which gets me to another point, that the Sandinista revolution has always been very Christian, but a very progressive leftist form of Christianity. That's basically liberation theology. In the 1980s, there were actually numerous Catholic priests who were ministers in the revolutionary Sandinista government. And basically, the Sandinista revolution was the only ever time in history when liberation theology, the leftist Christian movements in Latin America, actually achieved state power. In most places, they were violently crushed by the CIA. So the CIA, for instance, backed these fascist death squads in El Salvador that famously killed now saint, recognized by the Catholic Church, the Archbishop Oscar Romero. He was killed while giving mass to poor people in a rural area by these CIA-backed death squads. Well, he was a socialist who supported this revolution, the revolutionary movement. And basically, in Latin America, the only time that liberation theology ever achieved state power was here in Nicaragua. So, yes, the abortion laws on the books are very bad. Although, since the Sandinistas came back to power in 2007, a woman has never been arrested, imprisoned for abortion. Unlike in Honduras, the great U.S. ally, the coup regime. In Honduras, women have been arrested for like decades, imprisoned for abortion. In Nicaragua, on the books, the laws are bad, but they don't actually arrest women. Although, unfortunately, yes, you have to go underground. But at the same time, again, a lot of Nicaraguans wouldn't even get an abortion because it's not popular. And finally, the other point I wanted to make about women's representation is that bourgeois feminists are obsessed with abortion, but they ignore everything else about women, like healthcare, education, children's like programs so children can have a place to go so their moms can work. All of these programs that are provided by the Nicaraguan government. And in Nicaragua, another key point about the Nicaraguan revolution, the Sandinista revolution, is that the Sandinistas mandated a law that 50% of all government positions have to be filled by women. And this is a policy that some left-wing parties around the world have been implementing more and more, of having like co-chairs. They have a man and a woman co-chair. And that's exactly what they do in the Sandinista front. They have a man and a woman co-chair for different positions. And in the government, the cabinet has to be half men and half women. And the government positions have to be half men and half women. And they actually implement this policy. On November 7th elections, all of the candidates from all of the parties, because it wasn't just presidential candidates, it was also candidates for the National Assembly, the deputies, the lawmakers, and all of the parties' candidates, because you don't vote for candidates, you vote for the party, right? So it's kind of like a parliamentary system in that way, although it's still a presidential system, so it's a little complicated. But anyway, there were 90 members of the National Assembly up for election on November 7th, and for every party, they had 90 candidates, and 45 candidates had to be women, and 45 had to be men. And because of the policies in Nicaragua, it has according to the World Economic Forum, like the heart of neoliberalism, they admitted that Nicaragua has the 5th highest rate of gender equality in the world and the highest in Latin America. It's up there with like the Scandinavian countries. So there's this bourgeois idea that the only form of feminism is abortion, when in reality, like, women in Nicaragua are very empowered compared to other parts of Latin America. It's not to say that like it's free of machismo, but you ask what Nicaraguan socialism is. I mean, it's all of those policies. And there still is private ownership of parts of the economy, of course, but all of that. And then finally, land reform, giving land to the peasants and taking land away from the big monopolies. Those are all the key elements of the Sandinista revolution.
Well, I have to say with the abortion thing, because this is something I've written a lot about and covered. I totally agree with you about this, with the Western feminists in particular. I think, one thing that people kind of neglect to understand is that abortion bans really impact people in poverty the most. And so the way to deal with abortion is to deal with poverty. It's not to just like give unfettered access to abortion. And it's also like, I think these like bourgeois or Western feminists, whatever you want to call it, like obsession with abortion is actually really alienating to the average person. The average person doesn't want to does not support using abortion as birth control, or like having like nonstop abortion. And most women, speaking as one, like it's not like something that you want to do. And so like prevention is actually more important, I think, than obviously I don't agree with making it illegal, but I really think that like if you're a government that's concerned with poverty, that's going to do more to like give women more control over their reproduction and stuff like that than just being like Canada. Like in Canada, we have like, you can get an abortion whenever, like we have no laws on it at all. But that doesn't necessarily empower women or their reproductive rights. So like, especially like if you're poor, that doesn't really, and in a rural area that's not close to a clinic, it's not going to help you anyway. So
yeah, and you mentioned prevention. I mean, it's really easy to get birth control here, and the government like gives birth control. If people want birth control and they're poor, they can easily get birth control. Like even though again it's extremely Christian, but in a very progressive, revolutionary way. Like President Ortega gives speeches talking about how Jesus was an anti-imperialist, Jesus was a socialist. I mean, Chavez did the same thing. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela almost became a priest. So like Latin America is very religious, but despite that, it's very easy to get birth control and it's very cheap. In fact, a lot of women, what's interesting is I've never seen this in the global north, but in Latin America, especially here, it's very common for women to get monthly shots instead of like daily pills. They do monthly shots, and the shots cost like $2 or $3, and you do it once a month, and you have to do it like a certain time at the same time every month or whatever. But like it's easy to get that
at the same time every day. So I mean, what's better?
Right.
But yeah, I totally think like, I don't know. I think that the abortion discourse here is awful in general, and when you're applying it, especially to like imperialism, it gets even worse. So it's like your own country is criminalizing restriction to abortion. Like, why don't you go deal with that like first?
Well, I think this is like so important because you see so many young, NGO world left-leaning activists that, really attack Nicaragua strongly for being like supposedly right-wing. But when you compare it to, I mean, as Ben was just explaining, the participation of women in politics, and you compare that to the violence against women in the rest of the region, I mean, El Salvador, I haven't been there, but it's awful for women. Honduras, my translator, when I went, 6 months prior, she had been kidnapped just for being a young woman. In Mexico, I mean, just in the north of Mexico, they do Halloween as well as Day of the Dead because they're right next to each other, and it's very influenced by American culture in the north. And there was a town that had a festival just like this past week where they had like a prop of a body in a trash bag, and it was supposed to be a woman, and they wrote under it, "You deserve this because you're a whore," in the public square, for this festival. So that just, I mean, rape is out of control. Violence against women is out of control in the region. It's devastating. And then you see these, people attack Nicaragua, where it's like 50% participation by women in politics. It's mind blowing, and you don't see them direct any of that energy. You don't see any of the like liberal left or like activist left attacking Honduras or El Salvador or Mexico. Well, you do see it now that AMLO's president. But before you didn't really see that so much. I mean, there was Ayotzinapa, which was a big issue for a lot of U.S. leftists. But the violence against women is an issue that's not. It's only an issue when it's in a socialist state, you know.
Yeah, and really quickly, I just want to, the idea that the Sandinistas are right wing or whatever is so insane, and it shows how willingly a lot of these so-called leftists just eat up propaganda against enemy states. I mean, we've seen this so many times with like China and Venezuela, like all these people claiming that Venezuela, that Chavez was good, but Maduro is bad and all this nonsense. But really quickly, so I just want to go through briefly the talking points trying to claim that Nicaragua is right wing under Sandinistas. Absurd. One is the abortion thing. We just talked about that. Two is the claim that supposedly that the Sandinista government made some kind of alliance with the Catholic Church. People outside, you constantly hear this claim in like NACLA and all these fake left outlets outside of Nicaragua. They constantly say Ortega made an alliance with the Catholic Church. That is insane. If you told that to people in Nicaragua, even the right-wing opposition would say that you're out of your mind. Look at this. Here is Mike Pence. If you let me share my screen. Here is Mike Pence. He constantly said this. If people actually followed U.S. policy in Nicaragua, they constantly criticize Nicaragua for supposedly attacking the Catholic Church. Here's Mike Pence.
And in Nicaragua, we've stood strong against Ortega's regime's brutalization of its citizens and its systemic and lethal attacks against the Catholic Church. We've imposed sanctions on all of those who would carry out this abuse.
So, and he constantly said things like, here's Vice President Pence is accusing Nicaragua's leader of waging war against the Catholic Church. Like, the Catholic Church is extremely closely linked to the right-wing opposition in Nicaragua. There were priests, including the Archbishop, Silvio Baez, the Nicaraguan Archbishop of the Catholic Church. He would lead the right-wing protests in 2018 during the coup attempt. And there are videos of these priests praying over the dead bodies of people killed by the coup plotters. Like, the Catholic Church played a key role. In fact, in the major city of Masaya, one of the main cities in Nicaragua, the coup plotters, they would shoot at the police and then they would go hide in the church because the church is autonomous and the Nicaraguan police couldn't enter the church, right? So after months of this, the people of Masaya got so tired of the barricades, the tranques they were called, the violent barricades that all of these coup plotters that they built in the middle of the roads trying to block traffic for weeks and weeks in the country. The same tactic, the same playbook that they used in Venezuela with the so-called guarimbas. The only difference is that in Nicaragua, they were called tranques, but in both countries, they lit left-wing people on fire. They lit dark-skinned people on fire. So here in the tranques, the so-called tranquistas, the coup plotters, they would shoot at police, and then they would run in the Catholic Church in the middle of the town of Masaya. And Hinotepe as well. And then after a while, people got so tired, not police, but people living there, that they went into the Catholic Church and they pulled out all of the coup plotters to let the police arrest them. Because these are like mothers and grandparents in the community being like, stop with this violence, we've had enough. And people from the community filmed themselves doing that, and they filmed finding tons of guns in the churches. In the Catholic churches. So meanwhile, all these dumbasses, I'm just going to call them dumbasses, who don't know anything about Nicaragua, are claiming that the Sandinistas supposedly made an alliance with the devil with the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church is backing a violent coup attempt and giving refuge to and holding guns, acting as armories for coup plotters. And meanwhile, these dumbasses outside of Nicaragua claim that Ortega compromised because he made an alliance with the Catholic Church that is trying to overthrow him. It is so insane. Every talking point, you look at all these talking points trying to attack Nicaragua, it's all absurd. The other talking point is that the Sandinistas, made an alliance with the right-wing capitalists, which would be a hilarious surprise to the right-wing capitalists here in Nicaragua who hate the Sandinistas. And you know who one of the main sponsors of the 2018 coup attempt was? One of the main sponsors of the so-called protest that began in April 2018. It was the COSEP, the Chamber of Commerce of Nicaragua. That the Chamber of Commerce is what initiated the coup. And it was led by all of the right-wing capitalists. And recently, there's been this propaganda campaign in the media in Nicaragua claiming that the Sandinista government is carrying out economic terrorism. Why? Because it's increasing taxes. And they said that the increasing taxes on corporations in Nicaragua is a form of extortion. It's an extortion racket and economic terrorism. So meanwhile, in the country, if you read the right-wing press, the elite capitalist oligarchs say that the Sandinista government are economic terrorists for taxing them, and the Catholic Church is organizing a violent coup attempt. Meanwhile, outside of Nicaragua, these dumbasses who call themselves leftists but are funded by NGOs and work in academia, they claim that the Sandinistas are allied with the Catholic Church and that right-wing oligarchy that's trying to overthrow them.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're so happy that you can, really be on the ground and see through all this and help the rest of us navigate it, because these propaganda campaigns that are waged on the left are intense, and they fool a lot of people. And we see it with Syria, we see it with Hong Kong, we see it everywhere with Belarus, Venezuela. So we're so grateful for you. Ben, do you have a moment to stick around? I just want to read some of the comments on Rockfin. There's only a couple.
Yeah, really quickly, I just wanted to add,
sure,
even where you are, Alex, in Mexico, I mean, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he's not Ortega, he's not a revolutionary, but he's a progressive, he's a nationalist. He's not a total puppet of the U.S. He has a totally, he just gave an important speech condemning neoliberalism and corporate policies. And, you know, he's the best leader Mexico has had in many decades, probably since Cárdenas. And there's the same disinformation claiming that AMLO is allied with the right-wing oligarchs, which is insane because meanwhile, the right-wing oligarchs are like holding these, they're like doing these astroturfed car protests and like putting out a bunch of tents in the capital city, pretending to be a bunch of protesters. Like they're doing everything they can to try to destabilize him. Meanwhile, these like fake leftists in the global north are like, AMLO is just a neoliberal. It's the same thing.
Yeah. And meanwhile, you saw them, the left use like climate change against Evo Morales. And I just remember this explosion of the Pemex facility in the Gulf of Mexico a few months ago. I think it was July. And actually, one thing I said at the time, because people who are viewing this have probably seen those videos of like, it looks like the portal to hell in the middle of the water. But AMLO had just sunk billions of dollars into this company. He's trying to nationalize it. And then all of a sudden there's an explosion. So I was, I don't want to say anything too explicit, but I was skeptical. And now I'm starting to see more social media influencers on the left in Mexico, say that, they think it might be the CIA or something. But, you see the climate change excuse there too. And you actually did a very good job. I think it was Peru, right? Where you, they had that eco-socialist candidate.
No, it was Ecuador.
Ecuador, that's right, yeah.
Who was neither eco nor socialist.
Yeah. And again, a U.S. puppet, right? So this, everything that we've talked about on this episode regarding Nicaragua, it's the same fucking playbook everywhere.
It's the point of your show. Like,
yeah. Well, that's what's kind of like killing me is like, it's the same playbook every time. And nobody acknowledges that it is, especially the left. And it's like, I just feel like we have the dumbest left wing in the world. Like, in us. And like, they just don't, like, they don't recognize it till like 20 years later. Sometimes maybe it's a little earlier, but like, like with Iraq, like now everybody knows that was a sham. Like, when is that going to happen with Syria in 20 years? I don't know. Like, it's just so tiring.
Yeah, like, here's an example.
I think Syria will be 30, 40.
Well, here's an example.
Go ahead, Ben.
The Nicaraguan government, there were over 230 international observers in Nicaragua for the elections from 27 countries. But there was all this fake news claiming that there weren't any foreign observers. And there was all this fake news claiming that foreign journalists were barred. That's not true. There were over 30 credentialed foreign journalists. Now, it's true that this propagandist from the New York Times was barred, named Anatoly Kurmanayev. And we actually, our friend Alan McLeod did a really good article with us at the Gray Zone, in which he interviewed this guy, Anatoly Kurmanayev, when he was at Bloomberg. And this guy is he's the New York Times Latin America correspondent. He was in Venezuela before, and he was working with Bloomberg and just doing insane fake news. He did like this insane fake story claiming that a box of condoms in Venezuela costs $400, a total fake story. And in order to do that, he used like the fake exchange rate and not the black market exchange. It's this whole complicated thing, but it was total fake news. So
the dollar today one, right?
No. Well, instead of using dollar today, he used like the official exchange rate, but it's not the real exchange rate. It's complicated. Anyway, whatever. The point is that it was fake news and it was blatant propaganda. And in this interview that this guy, this current New York Times reporter, did back then with Alan McLeod, he called himself a mercenary. And he said, yeah, well, we're just mercenaries. We just do these stories. We do sexy tricks, he said. We're mercenaries to get people to click on them, to get people to... So this guy is not a journalist. And of course, the New York Times hired him to do reporting on Venezuela and then now Nicaragua. And the New York Times sent him to Nicaragua, and he was rejected entry. Ortega actually, he didn't mention him by name, but in a speech that he gave after the election, Ortega gave this badass speech. It was talking about based, and in which he said, and then he said, the foreign corporate media outlets that all just print fake news and lies. He said, we didn't let them in because they're agents of the CIA. But here we had real independent journalists, not those CIA agents. So like,
yeah, it was like the left forum down there or something even better than the left forum, like a better version of it down there this week.
Well, I mean, but there are also other like international journalists that aren't just leftists. They have like people. They had 27 countries. But like the thing is like the left in Latin America, they know, they're not dumb. They're like, yeah, the New York Times is a CIA propaganda outlet. Like there's nothing. Meanwhile, like there's so many people on like the respectable social democratic left in the US and Canada. Well, they're like, but the New York Times said this. Oh, but the New York Times. In Latin America, they're like, nah, fuck the New York Times. It's the CIA. Like that's to me, that's such a huge difference between like people in the US and Canada. A lot of the left, they're desperate for respectability. Talk about respectability politics. They're so desperate to be respected by liberals. They want to be taken seriously by liberals. And in Latin America, they're like, no, fuck, we're revolutionaries.
Well, I think also there are some like true believers, and I think it comes from this like romanticizing of any kind of like aesthetic of resistance, which is why they like latch on to like otherwise reactionary movements. Like, who would have thought that like a left winger would be cheering on Al-Qaeda? It's like because it's like there's this grand idea of resisting a dictator, and that's all that matters. It's like the same kind of idea that animates like the Antifa LARPing, or whatever you want to call it. Like it's this like this Western left. It's not just that they want to like please liberals, but they love like radical aesthetics, or like as Caleb had said, like being the king of the protest cage, rather than like actually just like agitating for meaningful change. And that's also why like they're purists about this abortion stuff as well, because it's like, oh, it's uncool, it's unradical to cede any ground on that. But then of course nothing gets done. There's no like successful anarchists. Like,
well, also like,
and they're militant. Go ahead.
It's in Nicaragua, polls consistently show that a majority of women don't actually support abortion. And even in Mexico, I just looked this up because I mentioned we were talking about it. The most recent poll, this is published in the major Mexican newspapers, the most recent polls from September, it says that 53% of Mexican women are against legalizing abortion and 45% support it. So like, I mean, and that's actually much more even than in most countries in Latin America. Now, I support, of course, legalizing abortion, or at least decriminalizing abortion. But like, even in Mexico, where it's a country where it's not as controversial, it's still a slight majority of women oppose it. And you can't just ignore a slight majority of women, especially if you want to be a popular leftist movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I think we're gonna wrap up the stream. But really quick, there's a couple comments I wanted to read. Mealing We says, "I wonder if Ben ever sleeps," which is a very good question.
That's a good question.
We often comments on my streams too. So thanks for joining us. It's always cool to see you.
We're gonna hire an investigative reporter to get to the bottom of that.
Well, I guess I didn't answer the question. I do sleep upside down like a vampire with my arms.
Listening to your death metal tracks, right?
Yeah.
And in all honesty, though, I'm a huge proselytizer for sleep, consistent sleep. I sleep very consistently. Also, my girlfriend works at an office, so like I have to be up at the same time every morning, but I get up with her even though I work at home. So I go to bed at the exact same hour every night, and I wake on weekdays, and I wake up at the same hour, and it helps me really be much more productive.
See, this is why Ben is so much more successful than me, because I'm up to like 4 or 5 in the morning.
Yeah, 4 or 5 a.m. and I was never very productive. Well, less productive at least.
So there you have your answer, Mila. Go ahead, Mila. Sorry.
But I said I don't sleep. I'm both a night owl and an early riser, which is like a terrible combo. But it's like that's the law student life. So.
And then you actually work out.
Yeah, I work out in the morning.
Like every day.
Yeah, so I'm like I might like drop dead in 5 years, but like hope not.
Yeah.
Well, I don't do that.
Probably I will, because I don't work out and I don't sleep. So.
Look at this. Here we have. All right, we have the person who doesn't work out but sleeps, me. We have the person who doesn't work out and doesn't sleep, Alex, and we have the person who doesn't sleep but works out. This is like that. It's like the Rumsfeld thing. This is the
troika of tyranny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So, and then Mealing also said that was exactly what the pro-West riot leaders did when they disbanded their group. She's talking about Hong Kong, divided up the dark money among themselves. And then Christopher Dobby also, he left us a tip. Thank you. He says, he's talking about the pre-candidates that were arrested, the quote unquote pre-candidates. He says, are those the ones that Amy Goodman reported on? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, Amy Goodman just reads the headlines given to her, which are written by like this horrible team of liberal interventionists overseen by Nermin Sheikh, who is another liberal interventionist. And they just like rewrite what the mainstream media says. So yeah, not only that, really quickly, just because we're talking about Democracy Now, I keep saying they jumped the shark and then they keep doing something even stupider. So here, if I can share my screen really quickly, this is Democracy Now's latest coverage of Nicaragua. They literally had a clown in Costa Rica. They interviewed a clown. Well, I guess it's some kind of archival footage, but instead of interviewing, as I said, the 65% of Nicaraguans who participated in the election, or the 232, actually that figure needed to be updated, the 232 accredited foreigners who accompanied the elections, they used this stock footage of a clown in Costa Rica. I mean,
yeah, that's actually the interim president of Nicaragua. Much less informative than your tweet.
Of Nicaragua.
So really quick, I wanted, if you have like a few more minutes, I know Mila's gotta go soon, but I just what's next in Latin America? What do people need to keep an eye on? Well,
this is the beginning of the second coup attempt here, and it's going to get brutal. It's going to be like the whole thing with Juan Guaido. The U.S., the Biden administration just passed the Renacer Act, which Biden just signed, And by the way, the Senate passed that 3 days before the election. Talk about election meddling. 3 days before the election, they told the Nicaraguan people, if you reelect the Sandinista front, we're going to punish you with devastating sanctions. And of course, the Sandinistas won, so now they're being punished. And there's going to be brutal sanctions imposed on the government. So that's going to happen. Then there's going to probably, who knows if they're going to try the whole Juan Guaido thing. For now, they can't because the Juan Guaido 2.0 people are in prison. The Juan Guaidotas, if you will, are in prison. So we'll see what happens there. But they're going to try to destabilize. There's going to be a lot of fake news. And in Peru, I mean, Castillo's government is extremely weak. Castillo is not, it's not looking like he'll even be able to last his term. His foreign minister was forced to resign by the military in what he called was a coup. And then his socialist prime minister was pushed out. And now the foreign ministry of Peru is basically run by the military. I mean, Peru is not looking good. And in Brazil, the Workers' Party of Lula da Silva released a really good statement on Nicaragua, criticizing the U.S. meddling, criticizing the sanctions, supporting the Sandinistas. And then there was this dumb internal debate by like the centrists in the Workers' Party, and they forced the Workers' Party to withdraw their statement. So a lot of people outside of Latin America look at the region and think that the situation is like really optimistic, but there's still a lot of like room for meddling. And the problem is not just the meddling. The other problem is something you acknowledged with this, what we saw in Ecuador. There's this new generation of mostly younger people who are basically trying to model the Latin American left after the great success of the North American left and the Western European left. They saw how amazingly successful the US and Canadian and European left was, and they're trying to copy them. So you have this candidate in Chile who's probably going to lose the election named Gabriel Boric. And he is like the NGO left. He represents the new generation of young 30-something NGO leftists in Latin America who like criticize Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua and talk about human rights and all this nonsense, like this ridiculous US government imperialist rhetoric. It's not about human rights. Of course not. And so he is the main candidate in the upcoming election in Chile this November. And he's competing against a Pinochet supporter in Chile. And it's very likely that, I mean, we'll see, but it's likely that the Pinochet supporter is going to win because of this dumb, like woke NGO leftist who throws all of the existing leftist governments in Latin America under the bus to try to appease mealy-mouthed liberals. It's exactly the playbook of the global North left. And unfortunately, it's becoming more and more prominent in Latin America among young people because they consume a lot of like global North media and culture, and because they're part of like this whole NGO nonprofit industrial complex, which in Chile, I mean, we'll see how it goes, but that's exactly what happened in Ecuador. In Ecuador, there was like this fake NGO left that tried to destabilize the Correísta, the leftist anti-imperialist movement, using some of the same talking points we're talking about, criticizing Correa for not legalizing abortion, criticizing Correa for being a nationalist and all this nonsense. So, I mean, it's counterinsurgency. And in places like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, it doesn't have an impact. But in places like Chile and Argentina, which there are a lot of people there who desperately like want to be white and want to be like accepted by the West, it's having an impact. And we're going to see what happens in November in Chile, but it's not looking optimistic.
Yeah. And I know Honduras has their elections on the 28th of this month.
Which I'm optimistic about those.
Are you? That's good to hear. I haven't been following as closely as I would like to. We have, what's her name? Xiomara
Castro.
The wife of the left-leaning former president who was ousted in a U.S.-backed coup in 2009 under the Obama administration. I actually interviewed her. She's a real leader, very charismatic person, and I think more popular than her husband for Hondurans. And then the United States, I think it's November 18th, USAID is backing more protests in Cuba. So those are also things to keep an eye on. Follow Ben Norton on Twitter at Benjamin Norton for really great investigative reporting and analysis on Latin America and other regions. But lately, I think mostly you've been focusing on Latin America. And check out his work on the Gray Zone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope that you learned something, and we hope to see you next week.